earlier. We will now move on to our first plenary session. I'd like to kindly remind to all participants to post their questions on Slido through the link provided on the screen in front of you. The new technology frontier in big picture. This first session will explore how the recent technological advancement, especially artificial intelligence, will revolutionize human life. Please allow me to welcome the moderator of the first session, Mr. Don Campbell, Chair of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, to take his place on the stage. Mr. Campbell, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Well, after a great opening with Sophia, she's a pretty hard act to follow, both in terms of content and in terms of her beauty, but we'll do our best. This session is going to be the big picture session, and I expect it's going to be, for a lot of us who are lay people in this world, both something that will inform us, will educate us, will maybe frighten us, maybe reassure us, but it is obviously a discussion with the accelerating pace of technology and the new technologies that is certainly going to change the way in which humankind operates in the future. And we're going to be very interested in hearing the presentations in terms of how quickly that future is going to come to us and the ways in which it will change the nature of work, the relationships of artificial intelligence, and eventually, I guess, artificial general intelligence, which at some stage, and I think you'll probably hear this word of singularity, when artificial intelligence surpasses the ability of the human mind. Some of it may sound a little bit like science fiction. That's sort of the scary part, so we'll see what our speakers. And we've got a wonderful array of speakers. First of all, I would like to introduce Luke Hutchison, who's going to kick us off. Do you want to come up, Luke? Luke is a computer scientist and a deep learning expert, was one of the original people with Kurzweiler at Google, is now working on something called parallel computing, which I learned a little bit at dinner with him last night. I can't say that I still quite understand it, but he's going to give us the broad picture of what it is we have ahead of us. Next, we have Wojciech Krok, partner at McKinsey, based in Singapore. He has recently come to the Asia-Pacific scene from Poland, and he is a partner at McKinsey and dealing with something called quantum black. I'm not going to take any particular note of the word black in all of that, but he will certainly tell us about that as well. We then have Imran Zuri. If you could come up with us, Imran. I went on the website and I was quite fascinated when it described Imran as the ultimate geek and mad genius who heads a pack of nerds in Databot and Hara here in Indonesia. And finally, of course, we have Jake Lucci, who's the head of content of AI Google. He comes from a policy and a law background, so I think that we've got a very broad array of talent for the discussion of this subject. We'll have the keynote by our first speaker, Luke, and then each of the other panelists will make presentations, following which we'll have an interactive discussion. And as you're all aware, how to ask your questions, which we will be more than happy to endeavor to answer. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Luke.
Sorry, I need to see my slides. Whoa. Hello, everybody. So when I was asked to give this talk, I was asked to speak about the singularity, about when that will arrive, when machines will become more powerful than humans. And I said, well, I can't really talk about that because I don't believe in that happening anytime in the foreseeable future. But I'll tell you what I can talk about, which is our need to apply machine learning in a responsible way. And the organizer said, well, that's actually not what we expected, but sure, that sounds like a great topic. So that's what I'm talking about today. I will be covering a lot of the limitations of machine learning, and a lot of my other speakers will be, hopefully I'm not stealing your thunder because I'm going to be giving the pessimistic side, but actually I prefer to think about it as a pragmatic view of machine learning as opposed to a pessimistic view. And anyway, you know what they say about the secret to happiness is to start with low expectations. So if we start with low expectations about what AI is capable of, then hopefully we'll be pleasantly surprised. So on my way over here, I picked up this popular science in a pharmacy. And the cover caught my attention, The New Artificial Intelligence, the Future of Nanobots Detecting Cancer, Killer Robots, ? So I want to show you just a few articles that are in this edition of Popular Science. I'll just read the titles here. Scared of artificial intelligence? You should know it's already everywhere. Google has a list of AI behaviors that would scare it most, and it just might scare you too. Who will driverless cars decide to kill? Google considers making a big red button to stop dangerous AI in an emergency. And this is my favorite, how to create super intelligent machines that won't kill us, preventing an age of Ultron. So these are the sorts of headlines that are filling mainstream media today. And honestly, I feel like this is irresponsible reporting. No offense to Popular Science. But it does raise this question of should we be concerned? And in 2015, there was a letter published by 150 extremely well-respected individuals, including Elon Musk, Peter Norvig, who is one of the AI leaders at Google, Stuart Russell, Stephen Hawking, and many other famous names that you would recognize. And part of that letter says, we could one day lose control of AI systems via the rise of superintelligences that do not act in accordance with human wishes. And such powerful systems would threaten humanity. Are such dystopic outcomes possible? If so, how might these situations arise, and what kind of investments and research should be made to better understand and to address the possibility of the rise of a dangerous superintelligence or the occurrence of an intelligence explosion? So assuming that this does happen, how soon could it happen? Here's a quote from a famous philosopher in the area of cognitive psychology, and I want you to try and guess who made this statement and when. So just for context, the beginning of the deep learning revolution, which is kind of this current wave, what we call an AI spring, this wave of interest in AI, started in 2006. So we're about 13, 14 years into it at this point. Whatever your answer is, this might surprise you. It was probably longer ago than you would expect. This was Marvin Minsky in 1970. He said, from 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. 1973 to 1978 was his prediction as the world expert in the time. So I worked with 300 of the best minds in AI at Google, and I'm going to be honest with you, nobody has a clue what intelligence really is or how to build it. That might shock you. I want to let this sink in a little bit. We all do our best to build intelligent systems, and we're interested in this process of understanding intelligence and replicating it for the benefit of humanity, but I don't think anybody in the world actually really understands what intelligence is. So I'm going to give you a reality check today on AI hype versus AI reality, and this is what I'm going to call the red pill. So if you've seen The Matrix, the movie, you take the blue pill, you go to sleep, you can believe whatever you want about AI. If you take the red pill, then you find out how deep the rabbit hole goes. So I'm going to assume you took the red pill, and I'm going to show you the matrix. This is what AI is. It's these 5 things. First, supervised learning. So we know this in the field of statistics as regression. This is fitting a line or a surface through a cloud of points. Second, unsupervised learning, which is also, to simplify it, it's clustering, basically. You take data and you find the inherent structure within the data set. The third thing we can build in AI is what's called reinforcement learning. Now, this is something that DeepMind has made famous, and it's a process of deciding how much time, as you're exploring a world, particularly as a robot, how much time you should spend exploring the world versus exploiting strategies that you already know are beneficial with respect to some reward in the world. So exploration versus exploitation trade-off, and the robot can decide how much time to spend doing each of those. The fourth thing we can build in AI is, this is what we call good old-fashioned AI or plain old-fashioned AI, and we talk about symbolic reasoning. This is really a graph search system. And in the 60s to 80s, we built a lot of AI systems like this. And this is why Marvin Minsky, by the way, in 1970 said we would build a human-like intelligence between 1973 and 1978, because this approach looked so promising. But it didn't pan out. All the funding was pulled. There was a crash, and we call it an AI winter. And that sort of boom-bust cycle has happened a couple of times now. And then the last category is sort of basic statistical techniques. So Bayesian inference, Bayesian networks, and other statistical techniques. This is it. This is all we've got. Everything we build in AI falls into one of these categories. And all of these are necessary but not sufficient for an intelligent system. So any intelligent system in the world does these things, whether it's the lowest form of life up to humans. You can prove that intelligences all implement regression. They all implement Bayesian inference. There have been various experiments done on humans to show that we use Bayesian inference and so forth. So we do these things, but they're not enough. If you build a system that implements Bayesian inference, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's intelligent. So what is intelligence, and how would you define it? And I've got 25 minutes, so maybe I should spend a minute and just let everybody kind of labor over this question. It's a really interesting question. And I don't know that, I made the claim before, I don't think anyone knows how to answer this question. I think a lot of people would debate that. A lot of people think they know what the answer to this question is. But if we knew what the answer to this question is, we would have already built it. Here's some examples. If you look at the Wikipedia page on intelligence, there's a section on definitions. And there are definitions going back about 200 years, all the way through to the most modern philosophers. And I'll just read a few keywords. Judgment, good sense, practical sense, initiative, the global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, to deal effectively with its environment, innate general cognitive ability, skills of problem solving, resolving problems or difficulties that the individual encounters. These are all great definitions of intelligence, but they are descriptive of intelligence. They're not prescriptive. They teach us what intelligence does, but they don't teach us how to build intelligence, because they don't explain why an intelligent entity does these things. So how will we know if we do build an intelligence? One of the most plausible things, at least the most famous test that's been put forward, is called the Turing Test. And in this test, we just saw an example of this actually up on the stage with Sophia the robot. People asked Sophia questions, and then we all had a chance to decide whether that response seemed human or not. And some of them did, and we were impressed. Actually, I was really impressed by some of the answers. And some of them were a little bit off, right? And so potentially, based on the fact that some of them were not how a human would answer, we would have determined that this was a robot. If you had a wall between you and the robot and you had to decide if that robot was real or not, this is the Turing test. Now, the test actually only tests the deceivability of the observer. It doesn't test the intelligence of the observed. So were you all sufficiently deceived into thinking that Sophia was intelligent? If so, she passed the Turing test. And this is the way that this test works. It's fundamentally flawed. One of the reasons why it's flawed is that if we build a superintelligence, once we build that first machine that is more powerful than a human brain, it can innovate faster than we humans can innovate. And from that point on, machines will leave us behind. This is the concept you heard of a second ago, the singularity. And the only way for a superintelligence to pass the Turing test is to act artificially stupid. So there's, in addition to artificial intelligence, there's a field called artificial stupidity, which is how do you fool a human into thinking that you're a human when you're a super intelligent robot. And it turns out that you can only pass the Turing test if you implement artificial stupidity. So this shows one of the many flaws in this reasoning. So we have to ask the question, which tasks require actual intelligence? And we're actually really bad at answering this question. In the top right quadrant here, you'll see things that are hard for humans and easy for machines. And this is something, ever since we built the very first computer, ENIAC, or even one of the earlier mechanical computers than that, these computers were able to calculate and do basic arithmetic faster than humans. So we were already left behind when we built the very first computer many decades ago. But then there's a category of things that are easy for humans and hard for machines, and this is where we're applying all of our effort right now in AI. Then there are problems that are hard for humans and hard for machines, and maybe this is sort of future AI, or things that we don't know how to solve, even as humans, but maybe machines can help us with. But really the two quadrants that we care about are the things that machines already do really well, the top right quadrant, and the things we're trying to get them to do well, which is the bottom left quadrant. So problems that require actual intelligence to solve need a whole list of things that we don't know how to build right now. One of them is pragmatic problem solving. So this issue of pragmatics, there's a whole field of psychology and philosophy around pragmatics and what that means. But it's sort of a practical way to take the situation in front of you and apply objective judgment and sometimes subjective judgment to make a good decision. There's judicious decision-making in general, which may involve will, and once you start getting into questions of will and consciousness, we really don't know what those things are. There's a theory of mind, which is an awareness of other people's minds, and this comes into play when we talk about things like autonomous driving. If you are driving down the road and you see another driver and you make eye contact, you know what they're thinking, you know that they've seen you, they know that they have seen you see them, and so there's kind of this back and forth that goes on, and you both collectively decide who's going to turn first. And machines don't have this ability to understand another being's mind. And people would say, well, you don't need that for driving. I actually think you do need that for driving, and maybe for some other problems as well. And there's also this issue of awareness of self. And again, you might make the argument that a machine doesn't need to be self-aware to be intelligent. But I think that intelligence is really the same thing as consciousness and self-awareness. So deep learning, which is the technology that everybody is really excited about, doesn't do any of these things, or many other things that I personally believe that intelligence does. Even as a hardcore computer scientist and AI researcher, I see a distinction between human intelligence and what we call AI, or machine learning. And actually, I don't really like the term AI because I feel like it's a bit of an oxymoron. It sort of contradicts itself, that there's not much that's actually intelligent from a human intelligence point of view in what we are building today. And yet, even though I would argue that many problems in the real world, and particularly autonomous driving, require true intelligence to solve, we are still giving these problems to deep learning algorithms. And they cause problems. And here's one of them. So this is a crash of Walter Huang. He was killed 2018, March 21st, by his Tesla in autopilot mode. And what happened was the Tesla was going straight up this lane in San Mateo in California. And then there was an exit lane that kind of went off the side. The main lane marker on the road was faded. And the exit lane marker had been newly repainted. So the car actually locked onto the exit lane marker and went off the road and crashed straight into the concrete barrier. It's a horrific accident, and it's something that a human would never do. So this is the problem with algorithms. They fail in entirely different ways from humans, and the failure modes to a human observer are entirely inexcusable. And actually, the car saw the barrier. The car had both radar and stereo cameras. It saw the barrier, but it decided that lane keeping, or staying in the lane, was more important than avoiding a solid obstacle. So that's what we call priority inversion. And we can't tell. A lot of these machine learning algorithms are black boxes. We can't characterize the failure modes until we actually see them fail in a lot of cases. That's a real problem. Tesla came out with a statement after this crash and said the driver had received several visual and one audible hands-on warning earlier in the drive, and the driver's hands were not detected on the wheel for 6 seconds prior to the collision. The driver had about 5 seconds and 150 meters of unobstructed view of the concrete divider with the crushed crash attenuator, but the vehicle logs show that no action was taken. So Elon Musk is basically saying that it's the driver's fault. But what he's not saying is the Tesla also had 150 meters of unobstructed view of the obstacle, and it still crashed into the obstacle. So this is a very common example of what we see in corporate use of machine learning, where the companies are not taking responsibility for the very technologies that they create. And I think it's a very serious problem. I don't have enough time to read you this whole thing, but there's from the same statement, from the same crash, Elon Musk argues that right now, if you're in autopilot mode, you're 3.7 times less likely to die with your car in autopilot mode than if it's not in autopilot mode. Turns out those numbers are completely wrong, completely inaccurate for many different reasons. But the statistics he's citing are actually, if you look at the real statistics, in the year 2016, which was the year that these statistics were reported, for the test miles that Tesla reported in California, there was one disconnect every 3.7 miles on average. So a driver was driving, and they had to take over from the car. So on average, every 3.7 miles, the human driver had to intervene. In the United States, every year, there were 3.7 trillion miles driven by humans, which means if every car were Tesla driving in autopilot mode, there would be 1 trillion times per year in the United States alone that a driver would have to take over suddenly and avert some sort of catastrophe. I guarantee there'd be more people dying if that were the case than the current roughly 40,000 deaths per year in the United States. And we're not even properly solving the real problems that don't require intelligence right now, like avoiding solid obstacles. This is one of many examples of a Tesla crashing into a fire truck. This has happened at least 2 or 3 times, where a Tesla has rammed straight into the back of a parked fire truck in autopilot mode. And what could be more visible to cameras and radar than a solid fire truck? So why is Tesla overselling this technology and minimizing the seriousness of safety issues, lying about the statistics? I'm picking on Tesla a lot, but they're a particularly good example. Because Elon Musk himself talks about the ethics of AI. He signed that letter I referred to earlier, saying we have to deal with the ethics of AI, and yet he's shrugging the ethics of these dangerous technologies that his company has released. So we need to start talking about corporate responsibility, not just ethics, but corporate responsibility. We should be taking responsibility for the things that we build. So I took computer science classes from 4 different universities, and I never once was required, including MIT, and I never once was required to take a single class on ethics or responsibility, or engineering responsibility even. So I see that as a real problem. Some of you probably have this poster on your wall, what would Elon do? And I would say, don't be like Elon. Take responsibility for the technologies you build. If you build it, then you are responsible. And make sure that it's safe for people. So the real dangers of AI are not evil AI, but bad AI. There's a big difference. Here's a quote from an article in Motherboard. There is a real AI threat, but it's not human-like machine intelligence gone amok. Quite the opposite. The danger is instead bad AI. Incompetent, bumbling machines. And this is the only article in this Popular Science that I really like, is this one here. I've got a little screenshot. The looming threat of artificial unintelligence. Stop fantasizing about super smart AI and start worrying about dumb algorithms. So I just want to cover a short list. I'm running out of time, but a short list of the real dangers of AI. So the first is bias and discrimination. A machine learning algorithm might detect that in 3 major crashes, all the license plates in the vehicles ended with the number 1. So then everybody that applies for car insurance that has a number 1 in the last digit now gets an increased policy, because that was just a feature that the machine learning algorithm decided was relevant to expensive crashes and expensive payouts. So everybody gets discriminated against. Nobody knows the reason why. The algorithm pops out a number and says, this is what you pay, and it doesn't explain why you have to pay that much. This sort of thing happens all the time. We don't even know what's happening. There's a term from the 80s called GIGO, or GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. I would propose another term, BIBO, bias in, bias out. And this is, I I made that up, so you heard it here first. But if you put bias into an algorithm, if your training data is biased, then you'll get biased results. Priority inversion, we talked about with the Tesla crash. Placing too much trust in automation through machine learning without appropriate failover and fallback systems. And then this is really interesting, deep fakes and the coming crisis of reality. So I don't know if you've seen deep fakes before, but we can create videos today with anybody's face, anybody's voice, saying anything we want. So what happens when we have both real claims about fake news being fake, and fake claims about real news? You know, what if a video about Trump saying something ridiculous comes out and he says, I didn't say that, that's a deep fake? How many people would believe that? And then what if there's a video of him really saying something, a fake video that people believe? And so, you know, this really messes with our concept of reality. And when you undermine your ability to trust reality, when you undermine trust, you undermine all of society, because society is built on trust. There are violations of privacy, and even if you have nothing to hide, you should still have an expectation of privacy, because that's one of the fundamental principles of freedom. And machine learning and big data analytics are being used all over the world now to create surveillance states and to track citizens. There's social credit systems in China and other places that are starting to be used. How do we balance privacy against security? If you really are if you have a good-willed government that's trying to protect its citizens, how do you balance privacy and security? And then there's the issue of filter bubbles. People actually like filter bubbles. They like having their cognitive biases reinforced. We also have the undermining of democracy through voter fraud and through the influencing of elections. All of these issues are about the human misuse of technology. They're not about AI somehow coming up with an evil motive and doing something to hurt humans. These are all human problems that are based in the misuse of technology. So how do we productively think about AI then? Firstly, we should think about intelligence amplification or intelligence augmentation, which is using a machine to make humans smarter. And we should look for problems that people care about, and how do we automate things, how do we take tedious tasks and make them and take that away from humans so they can do more meaningful work. The second thing is AI allows us to sift through enormous quantities of information, so we should look for data sources in our organization that we haven't yet looked at. And before you can start thinking about AI, you have to start doing data science, because there's no point applying AI if you don't know what the data is that you have, if you're not capturing all the data that you can even feed into the AI algorithm. So the first step is find a data science team and start looking at what you have. Start looking for correlations between variables that you didn't know were present, and see if you can find ways to optimize your business processes. And then focus on tasks that require snap judgment, speech processing, text processing, computer vision, and prediction. These are all things we can do well with deep learning. Educate yourself so that you can smooth over the peaks and troughs in the hype cycle. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't buy into all the hype. Machine learning is a very powerful tool. See it for what it is. Learn what it can do and what it can't do, and then be productive with it. And when everybody else crashes because their expectations weren't met, you can keep going with machine learning, and you can smooth over these kind of troughs and peaks in the hype cycle. So my final points are simply take responsibility for the technologies that you create. Make them safe, make them effective, make them fail gracefully without hurting anyone, and don't oversell or overpromise. Remember that the sum of a human brain plus a machine will always be greater than either of the individual parts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. I'm going to say that was a bit of a cold shower in terms of some of the a necessary cold shower, I should say, in terms of some of the hype surrounding AI. And we'll get into the question period in terms of some of the questions that I have for you on that. Let's turn now to our panel, and we'll start off with Wojtek to make a presentation from McKinsey.
Sure. Thank you very much, Don. Do you have a clicker? This one? The green button, okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, very exciting to be here. My name is Wojtek. I'm a partner at McKinsey. And I think, Luke, you're a tough act to follow. That was a great introduction to AI. I think I will speak a bit from a different perspective. So I will take the business angle and more the economic angle of things, and how do we at McKinsey believe that actually the world around us is changing, and maybe see some, turn on some warm water, to your point, and put some more positive spin on the whole story. So I think, as we start, right, I mean, for me, when I look at this, I think the future is undoubtedly exciting, right? I mean, all the opportunities that AI, and counting the dangers as well, but all the opportunities that it brings to us is just an immense thing how the global economy will change, right? And of course, there are, I'm just trying to make this work. Yeah, many, many, many things around us will change, and this is just a story to start us off. How many of you know this picture? I mean, just maybe a show of hands, right? So the world around, one, that's very good. No, so the world around us is changing so fast and so rapidly that actually this is a picture of a painting generated by AI that was recently auctioned in Christie's, the famous auction house, and somebody paid $500,000 for it, right? If we would look, a couple years back, things like this, I mean, we wouldn't hear about things like this, right? So I think the point I want to make is that artificial intelligence, machine learning, it is changing the world we live in, whether we like it or not, right? It is changing everything we do. Now, for us at McKinsey, when we think about this, we like to frame the situation around us as a fourth industrial revolution, right? We all know the steam engine, electricity, computers, and all these revolutions have brought change, have brought new ways of working, new inventions, but also have brought enormous prosperity, right? On the chart, you can see the various amounts of GDP per capita increase in the first 40 years of each revolution, right? The question is, what is today and tomorrow, right? What is happening around us? We call it the fourth industrial revolution. Oh, sorry. So for us, there are 5 things that are fundamentally changing in the world of business, right? The first thing is the computing power we have available to solve our problems has tremendously increased, right? Since the year 2000, the supercomputing power, I mean, it's a 35 times increase in that number, right? If you think about, all our devices, the ones we have in our pockets, on our arm, they generate so much data. If you look at all the data that was created in the world, 80% of it was created only in the last 2 years. There is exponential data growth. We're all producing huge amounts of data. I think I like the third one in particular. I wish all prices would behave like this, but since the year 2000, the cost of storing, 1 gigabyte went down 99.5%. So it is also very cheap to store all that data, right? There are more than 30 billion connected devices, which, take all the information about us, about machines, right? We can use all that. And of course, all of this is coupled with the algorithms that allow us to make better predictions based on the computing power and based on the huge data volume. And also what is happening since 2010, industrial robots which can act on these predictions, on these decisions that the algorithms make, have increased 3 times since the year 2010, right? So if you look, all of that is fueling a fundamental change for business and for world economies. Yeah, and we might think that, it's a thing of the future, but for me it's a thing of now, right? Already, AI or machine learning, I mean, we can call it different names, but these technologies are changing the way businesses operate, changing the way we live, right? To name a couple of examples, I mean, we have Gmail, looking at our emails and filtering what is spam, what is not. We have, Netflix recommending us videos based on our past patterns. We have McDonald's changing the operations of its restaurants, right? I mean, in the US, you can even imagine there is a robot that flips burgers based on computer vision, right? And, of course, that poses a threat to the people that actually cook the hamburgers in terms of their jobs, but this is something that is happening whether we like it or not. I mean, these technologies are available to companies. There is also as Luke mentioned, a growing hype, but people are pouring billions and billions of dollars into startups that do basically AI research and AI products. Here on the chart, you can see the number of billions of US dollars that global venture capital firms are pouring into this field. And in 2017, that number stands as $15.2 billion, which is a very huge number, right? And you can see some of the startups that have received the highest funding on the left-hand side of the chart. One of them, for example, they solve some of the most common problems that are right now labor-intensive. One of them is, for example, Neuro, which is a robotics company that solves the last-mile delivery problem. I mean, in Indonesia, you have Gojek, right? Now, what Neuro does, it has a robot with computer vision that basically brings all these things to your home without a human intervention. You know, the saving, the efficiency of that is just immense, right? And they have received $1 billion funding to advance their research. And we will see this number grow even faster. That is our prediction, right? So the amount of money poured into this space to fuel global growth will be very large. As we move into, you know, a more general view of the economy, McKinsey Global Institute, which is our internal think tank, has made a calculation on how much all these technologies that we speak about, how much this revolution can add to the global economy, and has made a calculation of the per sector potential, right? Here you can see, you know, the AI impact. If we use already available technologies and apply them to existing businesses and existing industries, how much efficiency, how much more, you know, productivity can be gained, right? And the estimation is around 3.5 to 6, around $6 trillion. With world GDP standing at around $85 trillion, this is quite a substantial addition, right? And you can see industries like retail or transportation and logistics, which will benefit from that automation and benefit from the implementation of these technologies. And, you know, it might sound like something that is, you know, far-fledged, but actually the world is changing right now. So we are working with clients, for example, retailers, who in the past, when they were trying to open a new store or decide what assortment to put in their existing store, they would have, you know, a large group of people kind of thinking through. Now, it is largely based on algorithms, largely based on the contextual data, for example, of a specific area in a country. And if you know that there is, you know, a school, there is, you know, a gas station, what type of store, how big you need to put, you know, the people living around, and you also know what type of assortment you put in, and that is done fairly automatically by some of the leading retailers, right? Same goes for travel logistics, you know, automotive assembly. All these industries can face change from using these technologies and unleash quite a lot of growth potential. Now, the second thing I wanted to say is that it is not easy to implement these techniques, right? And this, I really like this slide because it's a quote from one of our German clients. So he said, you know, everybody's talking about AI. I see the potential. I understand how it can be made, but I'm not getting the impact. I'm not really getting the bottom line dollars flowing in. And he said, I have more pilots of AI implementation than Lufthansa, right? Because, you know, everybody's trying to implement, but nothing is, I mean, sometimes it's not taking off, right? So that's why the pilot, Allegri. Now, we did a survey among companies here in Southeast Asia as well. And we see that, you know, although everybody's aware of the potential, when we speak to CEOs, they say, you know, this is one of my top 3 things on my agenda, right? Implementing more of these technologies. But yet these statistics are a bit chilling from, you know, how much impact you can actually get. So only around 12%, and these are leading Southeast Asian companies, say they have a full analytics transformation in place and are getting actual business impact from using these technologies. 60% struggle to find the right talent. To enable this, you need the best, you know, engineers, data scientists. Now, 60% is a very large number, and again, leading companies, right? Now, 55% have a problem with getting their data in the right shape, connecting it, making it usable, making the quality good enough, right? And people are also struggling how to bridge the gap between, you know, data science world and the business world. These two need to work together because in the end, you know, the impact comes from the front line. AI is there to, you know, help the decision making and help the way in which we actually run our businesses, right? Now, I think the last point I wanted to make is if you want to make, you know, AI work or machine learning work in your organization, you shouldn't focus so much on only the modeling, right? Now, if we're talking about super advanced models or more basic models, we need to much more focus on how to embed these things in our businesses, right? And it's easy for a startup who has, for example, you know, one model and is trying to do one product. If you're a large oil company, if you're a large telecom, a large bank, you want to have 100 of these things working together. You want to make them, you know, explainable. You want to add a lot of things to them to make them responsible as well, right? Now, for us, when we look at this, it's a chain of, you know, looking at your data, looking at the algorithms, but also looking at, you know, which actions and interventions you can take, and also looking at culture, because in the end, it's about the people who will use this, right? So when we work with our clients, we try to take a very much end-to-end view to solve this problem. And we're starting now to see many more companies, taking that end-to-end view and adopting these technologies. But I think the two messages I would like to leave you with is, number one, I think the potential is very big. I think there are risks, granted. And also that it is a very, very difficult thing to do. And an end-to-end view is necessary in order to make this a reality for some of the largest companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wojtek. We'll now ask Imran to make his presentation. Imran.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So the task is to give an overview of applications of big data, blockchain, and AI in emerging economies. Actually, the opportunity is there. The growth of big data and AI projects are all in Asia. Although the North America still have the larger part, but the growth are all in this region. And Indonesia also in the top 3 in the region in terms of implementations of big data and AI projects. But it's still mainly covering 3 areas. When we talk about beyond pilots, this is a large project with impact. It's mainly telco, FSI, and retail. And it doesn't really move outside of that. Yes, we have some industrial internet projects or healthcare, but it's still quite small compared to these 3. And the benefit so far is to improve business process and enhance consumer experience. That will cover most of the project's impact in the region. The biggest challenge is still the same. It's data integration, because we have more talents coming in, and actually a lot of data science process already been automated by AutoML. But still, the biggest hurdle to implement is data integration because of silo data. There is no linkages, no connection between data, and there is no accountability for the available data. And we're talking raw data here. We're not even talking about the data that is required to train the machines. Now, labeling is the biggest hurdle, another process, because it needs to be accurate. It needs to be non-biased, like Luke said. So that's even more challenging. And this is the biggest surprise. In the region, it's very difficult. Why is still a problem? Because there is still 1.1 billion people are still invisible without proper ID, out of 7 billion. That's a large number of people with no digital identification whatsoever. And low digital penetration in most emerging economies. Even in Indonesia, in Java alone, where we operate, in some cities, the internet connectivity is only covered around 30% of the whole area. Because the aim is to serve internet penetration for the high density populated area. We're still not talking about IoTs or things outside that. So these are the thing that needs to be solved quickly, because otherwise then all these talks about Industrial 4.0 is just a talk. But interestingly, the level of implementation on AI is actually happening a lot that somewhat is hidden within our views. Like things to watch, the digital startups is already start moving their analytics from usually at the back, now moving at the front. Why? Because to eliminate the problem of garbage in information. So the analytics is now already happening when the data acquisition is happening. And it is strange, in the region, the first implementation of a lot of AI projects is for fraud detections. These are a picture of Gojek and Grab demonstrations of drivers, that get caught because of fraud. And just to tell you how big this fraud detection business is, in Gojek alone, they have 100 people doing this, compared to only 20 people doing routing optimizations. In China, you get 1,600 peer-to-peer lending, and you get 300 Uberized debt collectors startups. who actually use AI to detect fraud detection of the debt collectors. So, but this is interesting because they learn a lot about human behavior. But the saddest thing is a lot of these algorithms are based on the assumption that of distrust. All the credit scoring algorithm of the peer-to-peer lending or the fraud detection is mostly based on the assumption that we cannot distrust other people. So we have to move from this assumption to create much better algorithm where it has to start from trust first, then distrust. Because the image and video recognitions also that being used to help the fraud detection is also based on that assumption. So it's quite ironic that in the future, actually, we tend to trust computer more than we trust other fellow human beings. So we don't need a threat from computers or robots, but actually the real threat is that humans distrusting more humans more in social media and so many other things. But they also made a lot of progress in terms of logistic and supply chain optimization, a lot of these startups. And the financial inclusion also. They use satellite, drones, IoT, image recognitions, and precision agriculture. And these are the things that are happening under the radar because it's not flashy, it's not there. But it's happening because the problem is real. Outside the identity problem, globally there is 1 billion adults who don't have an account in a bank. Even in America, there's still 5% of financial inclusion problems. On the blockchain, it's also the same. Emerging economies are adopting blockchain faster than anyone else. Every big blockchain project are happening in either Asia or the emerging economies. Maybe because the government is a little bit more less concerned, so they have much more freedom. And even unicorns are paying attention to this blockchain phenomenon. And what they see is not only a technology, but possible ways of having a new business models. Like Gojek just buys the biggest blockchain startup, CoinsPH, for $72 million. Why? Because the Filipino workers, migrant workers alone, paid $2.29 billion just for transferring money in 2019. But the biggest blockers of a lot of blockchain projects is still government regulation, because they still don't understand, and some government cannot even differentiate between blockchain and Bitcoin. But surprisingly, they also, a lot of Asian countries also, the ones who actually support a lot of initiatives, like in Thailand, in Philippines, they're quite open to that. So again, even though they don't really know what it is, but a lot of the big blockchain projects are happening also in the regions. So how could we combine all of this? Because I think it's there is an element of interest of combining all of this. This is the problem that we're having in agriculture in Indonesia. This is measurements that Indonesian farmers use to define the length of their land. It's so diverse. And most emerging economies like Asia is also as complex as this. This is why doing something with AI is more challenging in emerging economies. Imagine doing this in India. But asymmetric information is very important because it's the single source of, the biggest source of low productivity of Indonesian agriculture, the asymmetric information. And this is what happened now. You might be surprised. Basically, there is no data on agriculture whatsoever in Indonesia. No one, not even the government, have any access to granular data on agriculture, because this is what happened, right? So what they have is just projections based on something that is actually based on another projections. So no traceability, no trust, no verification, nothing whatsoever. So how could we use AI on agriculture if we don't have the proper data to begin with? And this is what we're trying to do by having a distributed ledger, so everybody can actually store at least their basic transaction or information openly and transparently. Then actually it opens up so much opportunities in terms of using the AI and machine learning to actually speed up even land titling process, supply chain, precision agriculture, or even financial inclusions. And then we only collect two important data. First, the actual digital identity of the farmers, and second is the polygon of the land. That's it. And just by having these two ground information, then we can use satellite to actually support the other informations. And by doing that, we are now working with several big banks to deploy, disperse money to this bottom of pyramids that used to be considered to be high risk. And we also work with the insurance company using, again, satellite information based on that ground information to teach the machines to help them recognize whether the claim of the farmers when they have pests or diseases are actually correct. And then later on, we can actually do yield predictions and do precision agriculture. But we have to start with the data first. And this is not, this is still very early. But I agree with Luke that in the future, what's still missing is the regulations that supports the implementation of the AI or machine learning on a larger scale. Like, for example, data privacy. And now what is even more important than data privacy is actually ethical algorithms. How could we minimize the amount of bias in algorithms? Because the problem is we have the tendency to trust actually computer more than humans. But actually, with the current algorithm that we have, if the computer is feeding biased information, it's actually more dangerous than humans, because at the moment they have no other means of checking whether the information biased or not other than statistics. And in a lot of statistics, you have to rely on your belief. Not a single person in this room actually ever seen a normal curve. It's a myth. No one ever seen a perfect normal curve. It's actually a myth. Even if you toss a coin in this room, you will never get a perfect normal curve. So only human can understand those things, okay? So we should actually use algorithm to trust other human beings more instead of the other way around. Because we still need human at this moment to guide us in terms of discriminations, because it's not logical. Righteousness is not logic. It's something that needs compromise and consensus. Methodology and algorithm is one thing, but we need to devise a social mechanism to agree on what kind of algorithm that we can actually use in the future to help our fellow human beings. That's it.
Thank you very much, Imran. And now our final panelist, Jake.
Thank you all for having me this morning, and to all the organizers for inviting me. So we've heard a lot of interesting bits of both sides of the AI coin, both the risks and concerns that exist around AI and also all the many opportunities that it presents to industry and society. So I'm going to talk about a bit of both of those coins and how we're, both sides of those coins, and thinking about how we're approaching those at Google. In terms of the opportunity side, at Google, we really see the way that we can harness AI technologies to augment human intelligence and to aid society in a few different ways. On the left, you see our most obvious one is around our products. So just to give one example of a product that relies on AI, Google Translate now relies on machine learning to improve the accuracy of its translations and increase the number of languages that we're able to introduce in Google Translate. But as you also saw in an earlier presentation, many of our products rely on AI now. It's something that is really a central piece of a lot of the product development that we're doing. But in addition to the product side, we also are thinking a lot about how we can take the core AI research that we're doing at Google and work with partners around the world to help solve big problems at scale. So one of the areas where a lot of machine learning techniques are yielding real advances is in the healthcare space. And so one thing that we've done at Google has been to partner with hospitals and researchers around the world looking at how computer vision and other types of AI technologies can be used to help diagnose diseases. To give just one example of that, one of the leading causes of blindness in the world is a disease called diabetic retinopathy, which is essentially for diabetic patients, the retina degrades and can lead to incurable blindness. But this is actually a disease that if you catch it early is very preventable. But the problem is that in many countries in the world, like India, there is a major shortage of eye doctors, meaning that a lot of people never get the disease diagnosed until it's too late. So what we did is we partnered with a local hospital in India to develop a way of using retina scans to then identify the early stages of this disease and then forward patients who are experiencing it onto for treatment. So in addition to the sort of how do we take technologies and apply it to solving problems, another big piece that we think about at Google in the opportunity space is how can we develop tools and platforms that empower the broader developer community to make sure that more and more people, more and more researchers, companies can take advantage of the advances that are happening in AI. So to give a couple of examples of how that works, one of the early things that we did at Google was to open source our machine learning software library, the same one that we use at Google, and put it up on GitHub so that developers around the world can have access to a lot of advances in machine learning software and to collaborate together to update these to make sure that we're all benefiting from each other's great work. Now, TensorFlow is still something, though, that you have to have a fair amount of machine learning expertise to really be able to use. It's not something that's super user-friendly for the average company. You have to have sort of a bit of in-house expertise to be able to use it. But cloud is an area where we've seen the opportunity to really expand machine learning to stakeholders who wouldn't have ever been able to use it before. So to give an example of that, one feature that I think was referenced earlier by Imran is we have a product called Cloud Auto ML, which essentially means that you don't have to have any in-house machine learning expertise. If you use Google Cloud, as long as you have a data set and are able to label your data set, you can access pre-trained models on Google Cloud and use machine learning in your company, as a government, fill in the blank, really. It makes it quite accessible to anyone who has access to a data set and is able to label their data set. So cloud is something that, as you heard earlier, is making machine learning really accessible, not only because of these types of pre-trained models, but also because of just how much cheaper it's made computing power. Because if you think about what are the key ingredients that you really need to have in order to be able to do machine learning, it's really three things. You need data, you need algorithms, and you need computing power. And the big roadblock that we had for a long time to being able to expand machine learning was that computing power was very expensive. And also there's issues with access to data, as we've heard as well. But both of these things are being solved now, and so it really is opening up opportunities for companies around the world, governments, and universities to start doing machine learning in ways that we haven't seen before. So we've already heard a lot of this, so I won't belabor this too much, but these are just a few of the different sectors that we're seeing real advances, where machine learning is being applied by lots of companies to improve the efficiency and the scale of their businesses. And then this is just a couple of examples of companies in this region and around the world who we're working with from the cloud side to use machine learning to help improve their business operations. One, of course, Gojek here, the Indonesian unicorn. I also wanted to flip to another issue, which is that even though at Google we really do think that AI is going to do dramatically positive things for humanity, for all of the reasons that we've heard on stage today, we also do recognize that the risks that Luke referenced are really real, and that building trust in these technologies for users, for governments, for general society is something that's going to mean that we all need to come together and think about what are the best approaches to addressing some of the risks and concerns that exist. And once again, not the sort of sci-fi risks. We heard this morning, not the sort of Terminator, artificial general intelligence, singularity type risks, but just very practical things that exist in machine learning systems today. And at Google, we'd been thinking about these problems for a long time. We had teams that were working on research to figure out how to address problems in AI safety or machine learning fairness. And we also had a lot of teams that were developing tools to empower the developer community to address some of those issues. But in addition to those sort of technical and research approaches, we also felt like that we needed to have a set of principles that both provided a normative framework for us as a company and also put an external stake in the ground to others to share what are the types of things that we think are really important and how we're developing our AI technology and also enabling other third parties to use our technologies. So last year, we released our Google AI principles. I won't go through these in a lot of depth just because of time limitations, but what we have here at the top are the 7 things that we do want to achieve with our AI technologies. And they cover a whole spectrum of things from social benefit, avoiding bias, safety, privacy, and then being made available, meaning that we want to empower others to use our technologies for things that accord with the purposes laid out here. But then we also have at the bottom a set of red lines. So these are things that we don't want to do. And so we use these red lines as a way of analyzing a particular product, a potential deal that we might do with a partner, a piece of research that we might publish. And if it violates any of these 4 red lines that you see at the bottom, we will not proceed with that or support a third party in doing these types of things. So how are we implementing these principles? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of technical things that we're doing. So to give you some examples, we've developed some tools to address bias in machine learning systems. We heard about the garbage in, garbage out problem, which is that if you have biased data sets that your machine learning systems will recreate or potentially even amplify unfair biases. So we have, for example, we have a team that's been working on developing tools to help visualize data sets to understand if certain feature values in a data set are over or underrepresented. Let's say if you have a data set for a job recommendation algorithm, do you have too few women potentially represented in that? So you're going to actually recommend men disproportionately for a job just because historically women have not been well represented in that profession. So you can actually visualize your data set by a particular feature value like gender and understand if it's proportional to the outcome that you want to achieve. And it also allows you to play with hypotheticals. So let's say you had an AI system that was recommending someone for a loan, and you wanted to understand, if I were to change someone's income, how much more likely would they have been to be approved for that loan or not, right? And these are not things that Google does ourselves, but I'm just giving you kind of hypothetical examples. So these tools are called What If and Facets, and they're available for free online for any developer or any deployer of an AI system that wants to use them. But then in addition to the sort of technical types of tools that we've put out there, we have also been working to create internal governance norms and processes to make sure that we're consistently implementing the principles all across the company. Because Google's very big, and we've always had a culture that has a lot of autonomy for different teams, different products, different research teams. And so we've wanted to really create a set of consistent governance processes that make sure that different teams are looking at these issues in a coherent way. So we have an internal review process that has a team that manages day-to-day operations, and any team can forward an issue for review. So if I'm a researcher and I want to publish a piece of research, I can forward that to the AI principles team to actually take a look at and say, is this something that presents concerns or not? We're also integrating it into our ongoing product review processes. So when we do privacy reviews, for example, we've now incorporated our privacy AI principle and the particular privacy issues that AI can present as part of our product review process. And then we also have an escalation process, so that for particularly challenging use cases, we will escalate those issues to our most senior executives to make a final decision. But I also wanted to highlight that Google, we've spent a lot of work thinking about our own internal approach, but we also recognize that as AI is a global technology that often involves people collaborating across borders, it's really important for the international community to come together and to identify shared approaches for thinking about how to address ethical issues. So I just put a few of those on the screen here. You can see we have, of course, the standard-setting bodies like ISO and IEEE that have been working on ethical AI issues for a while now. The OECD just this year passed the AI principles, which I think are the first multilateral sort of binding set of principles that governments have agreed on together, and that are really positive, and I think they're going to be doing a lot of work over the next year building out more specific guidance on how to implement those principles. And then also, just one example of a national initiative, the Singapore government has released a model AI governance framework that provides really practical guidance to companies that are starting to deploy AI technology for the first time at scale. And I think it's a great example of a government releasing something that is flexible, is adaptive, it's not going to stifle innovation and hold back the ability of the technology to solve a lot of the big problems that we've talked about today, but at the same time helps to give a practical set of tools to make sure that we're not exacerbating any of the risks that we've also heard about today. So I'll leave it there for now, but I look forward to chatting about more of these issues during the panel. Thank you.
Do we have the Slido process working? Don't know the answer to that. Somebody can look into that. Well, first I would like to thank all of you for some very stimulating presentations that raise a whole array of issues. I think that you have provided the audience with a very broad picture of a very broad view of the big picture, and you've drilled down in a whole number of areas. I guess, Luke, I'd ask you first. We talk about singularity out there, and the impression I get from you that that's a long way off, a fair way off, a long way off, and is it a goal that is inevitable, or one that we should be striving for?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for background, I actually was hired by Ray Kurzweil as the first member of his AI lab when he was hired by Larry Page. So Ray Kurzweil is famous for popularizing this idea of the singularity. So I got a lot of, and I also attended Singularity University in the first year. It's in the inaugural class, so I've had a lot of sort of being bombarded with this message of the singularity. The singularity really, in my opinion, to be completely honest, I think it's science fiction. I think it's really interesting science fiction. But I prefer to think in terms of pragmatic approaches to AI, as I described earlier, and specifically in terms of machine learning engineering, so solving concrete problems today in the real world. I mean, I love science fiction as much as the next person, so I love seeing depictions of future times when AI is dominant, but I just don't see that happening in the real world. But I do think there are a lot of problems of the sorts that the other panelists mentioned that can be solved today, where we can improve the quality of lives for people and improve business processes.
We talked a little bit about this being the fourth industrial revolution. I have the sense that this is a revolution unlike any other. First, in terms of the the pace of change that we're having, the acceleration that we're having in machine learning and the effect that it is going to have on our economies and on our people, and the way that is very much going to, and I'd like anybody to challenge me, that is going to revolutionize the way that people work, the way that people are educated. It's going to have effects on health, on longevity, on climate change. I mean, the list is almost endless, and that, of course, brings fear. I mean, one of the first questions that comes to my mind is our educational system adequate at the moment to provide the kinds of expertise and the talent that you need, both in the engineering side, but also on the broader social side in terms of law and regulation and policy? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think it's adequate at all. Because at the moment, they're just concentrating on delivering the skills that they think are needed to be able to survive in the machine learning, which is basically they teach these kids to code, to be data science. All this profession that I believe even Google trying to make it disappear in the next 10 years. So what we should teach the children right now is to, beyond that, is to prepare themselves where they can cohabitate with robots and computers, where they can be human more than just doing all these repetitive tasks. And these are not being addressed in our school nowadays, because the days where we're preparing these children to be a productive workers will be gone at some point. We will not, I agree with Luke, we will not reach the stage where computers can actually, create an original jokes, but but they will replace a lot of these mundane jobs or, productive jobs. So we should prepare these kids to live in that world. So, and these are the things that I don't think that our university, our educational systems is preparing them for. They have a problem even when in the next 10 years all these degrees doesn't matter anymore, because we don't need them. So what happened when the days come in the next 25 years where actually government can provide universal basic income for everyone, so they don't have to fear computers anymore? At least their livelihood is guaranteed. And what's going to happen then? So, and this is going to happen, I believe, in less than, it's going to happen quickly, because, even, in my organization, we are an IT company, right? Every 3 years, I have to fire people within my department simply because their profession doesn't exist anymore. So even in IT, more and more jobs is being replaced by machines, by being automated. So I think that we should prepare the educational systems to prepare, especially the young generation who are now probably 4 or 5, to live in that kind of world where they don't really have to work as such.
Maybe just to build on this, I think, and I completely agree, by the way, right? I think creativity and problem solving should be the skills that our schools teach instead of teaching hard skills. Because the one thing that we will see is a huge pace of change in the way the future of work will look. Now, McKinsey Global Institute has run an extensive survey which we called the future of work. Now, if you look at all the tasks, I don't mean jobs, I mean tasks that people perform in their jobs globally, using current technology, currently available algorithms, robotics, etc., 50% of these tasks could be automated today. It's not a problem that we don't have the technology to automate these tasks. The problem is that we need to basically implement that, right? And if you look at 50% of the tasks, now the people who that would influence on a global scale, I mean, there are various estimates. We would estimate that number at around 400 to 800 million people until the year 2030 will face some sort of disruption to the way their job is performed, and potentially will have to seek a new type of employment, right? I mean, the study goes on with a very positive view of that because, all this innovation will create economic growth, will create new jobs, and actually the job loss on a net basis will be minimal. But what that will mean for the workforce is a big need to be able to adapt, to kind of problem solve, to be creative, and to seek kind of new forms of employment, right? The only thing is, short term, that will create a lot of strain on the economic system, right? Because, long term, the net is zero. Short term, there's a lot of responsibility on the corporate world, on the governments for things like, reskilling, retraining, seeking out, how to transition people, for example, from being a truck driver. I mean, I know accidents, etc., but I think, many of the truck driving in, for example, the United States will be autonomous. How to reskill them into the new jobs, right? And that will be a major challenge, right? But the new jobs will appear. We will have jobs that we have not yet seen in the year 2030. And I think creativity and problem solving are the two things we should teach young people.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I think the other important thing is there's going to be an increasing number of companies that are incorporating automation into their processes, but where their staff are going to have to interact on a day-to-day basis with automated systems. And I think one thing that's not often taught well enough is how to interact well with computers day-to-day. So how to avoid things like automation bias, which is the sort of your computer says yes syndrome, where let's say, I'm an employee and I get an output from an automated system that tells me something about someone, that, this person is XYZ likely to, default on a loan. Then how do I actually take that process but understand the potential biases in the system that might have existed? How do I know where to, inquire further, where to sort of, probe and figure out if the system is creating issues? So how do you actually interact with computers and get a lot of value out of them, right, out of automated processes, but at the same time not overly defer to them and be able to scrutinize them when needed? And those types of human-computer interaction skills are going to be really important. In addition to, I agree, creativity, problem-solving, teamwork, those are the types of things that are very hard to automate away.
I just want to add that there's an excellent and very long blog post out there. I think the title is "Robots Have Been About to Take Over All of Our Jobs for the Last 200 Years." Yeah. And it's this extensive study that this guy did. He went back in 200 years in time, looked at all the press releases, all of the media where people had said since the Industrial Revolution, robots are going to, or automation at the time is going to take over all of our jobs. And it has happened, but it's been all these meaningless jobs have been replaced with more meaningful jobs, as all of my panelists have said. And so really it does come down to educating yourself for the next level up of jobs. And like you said, the net loss is not that great. But there are different types of jobs. They're richer jobs, they're more meaningful jobs, and that's actually a really good thing.
Everybody, I guess, is in a race going forward. And I guess I'd be interested in your views on the role of governments and national champions. Many governments, including my own government, have a national strategy. My own government of Canada have a national strategy for AI. But do you see the introduction of AI in the economy to be a positive force in terms of equalization or reducing the difference between the rich and the poor, the developing and the developed, or do you see this being more national kind of competition from looking at it from an industry perspective? Anybody want to tackle that?
No, sorry. For me, the government topic obviously is a very wide topic, right? For me, what governments should do in this topic is basically create a basic framework for the development of AI. And I think it was mentioned by some of our colleagues. I mean, you mentioned that governments don't really understand this field, right? For me, a basic framework to kind of tackle some of the things like, bias, explainability, privacy regulation, putting that in place is the minimum. And then, I mean, in my personal opinion, is, don't interfere too much in things beyond that, right? So just set the basic framework, make sure, kind of nobody gets hurt. It's all, fair. The privacy laws are in place, but, I'm a huge fan of the technology. I would love for it to, develop and serve humanity in the long term. I think we need basic rules, but I don't think governments can keep up with the pace of change, to be very honest.
I somewhat agree with that. Like, for example, even now the Indonesian government should actually be concerned. Not just what happened in the rest of the world, for example. Now Amazon, Google, Facebook have more data than any government. And even the Ministry of Health, I don't think they have the capacity to understand human being like Gojek, because Gojek knows precisely how many of you in this room are ordering gulai tunjang for the past 5 days. So Gojek can predict the potential of heart attack much more accurate than the Ministry of Health. And they don't realize that yet. And of course, the startups are downplaying their strength. But imagine the combination of AI, big data, and blockchain. If the government are not careful enough, they become irrelevant at some point. Truly, truly irrelevant, because if people can manage through blockchain, for example, regulating, redistributing wealth among themselves through a consensus, and with the help of non-biased AI to help them, make that perfect curve, then maybe we still need the government to, I don't know, tax things. That's it, and leave us alone, like you said.
No, so just
I think if we're going to have a universal income, we're going to need taxation to provide the universal income. And of course, there are a whole other set of issues on data privacy, on what I call the lights and shadows of technology in terms of militarization, which governments could be responsible for in a positive or in a negative kind of way. So having come from a long bureaucratic background, I'm not quite ready to talk about the irrelevance of governments. But I think it is fair to say that it's nothing new that governments are struggling to catch up. We've always been trying to catch up with what is happening in the real world and trying to regulate it in a positive kind of way. Luke?
One thing that's really unique about the world that we live in today, and particularly the approach to AI and machine learning, is we live in an era of radical openness and radical sharing of knowledge, even from corporations, as far as the machine learning world applies. It's partly because most of the researchers that are working on AI today at the big companies, they all have PhDs, they're all from academic backgrounds, and they've sort of brought that culture with them to the companies. The companies they work for have these extremely deep pockets. And so you have Google and Alibaba, Tencent, Amazon, Facebook, all the big companies now are sharing all of their results. And in fact, if you produce an amazing result and you don't share it, you're seen as a bad player in the ecosystem. So there's this kind of social pressure for everybody to share radically with everybody else. And that really is an equalizer. I mean, it levels the playing field for companies. Even small companies now can download enormous pre-trained models from Google and other companies, enormous data sets, and can very cheaply get access to cloud resources. So that's also within the purview of governments. Even small governments now can make use of these tools. And as I mentioned in my talk earlier, that can be a great thing or it can be a bad thing because it also can contribute towards a surveillance state.
Yeah, I can give you a practical example where government is at contradictions. Like, for example, right now the Ministry of Transportation is still trying to impose regulation to set minimum and maximum tariff for Gojek and Grab. How could we use AI to do that? If they're gonna impose a minimum and maximum, and then we want to use AI to optimize, that's an oxymoron. So they should actually create a rules and regulation that allows that to be judged by algorithm, because consumers are king now. If Gojek is the price elasticity. So if the object prices is beyond what the consumers were willing to pay, they will drop anyway, right? So you don't need the government to regulate that, because by doing that, you're actually killing the opportunity to use AI. And this is just about price elasticity. Imagine if we use AI to actually derive more and more rules that concerns citizens, because they can optimize better than any government can, right? And they can be also more flexible because they can change the regulation just like that when it needs to be done, just by looking at the behavior of its citizen. So, yeah, I think the government has to redefine their roles. The traditional roles of trying to mediate control, I think that's the one that is in danger in the future.
Yeah, I agree with the other panelists that I think there's a real danger in coming up with too many hard rules because the technology is changing so fast. And the other important feature is that it's not, I mean, AI technology is a huge umbrella term. It's not one thing. I mean, AI is a whole series of different practical engineering techniques that can be applied in a whole host of different sectors and in different ways. And what you would want in terms of rules would vary a lot by sector. You know, what you need for autonomous vehicles is going to be very different than what you need for content recommendation algorithms, right? So I think that there is that danger there. But I do think that there's other helpful roles that governments can play, because as there are more and more interesting ethical approaches, responsible development approaches out there, I think there's a great role where governments can kind of be a convener and a collector of good practices, you know, in a way of issuing guidance and ideas that are flexible. It doesn't have to be a hard, you know, legislatively mandated rule, but a sort of flexible set of guidelines that can be applied in different ways by companies. And I think playing that sort of convener type role could be a really useful thing. And then we've seen that some governments are doing already. I think Canada has done that a bit. Singapore, as I mentioned, has been doing that. So there are governments who are thinking in that way already.
Thank you. I think, to be fair to the audience, we have some questions on the Slido that we'll try and do fairly quickly as we're running out of time. The first question refers to Tesla, so I think it's directed to you, Luke. It says re-Tesla autopilot statistically is still safer versus human accidents. Do you think the media backlash is proportionate? Could it hinder progress and development?
It's a great question, and I did come down rather hard on Tesla during my talk. But I think they're a good example, as I said, of a broader industry trend. And the backlash is harsh against, and this will continue, particularly as more accidents happen, which they will. But you have to understand this is part of a very common process. It's been termed the Gartner hype cycle, where you have a technology trigger, a peak of inflated expectations, a trough of disillusionment, slope of enlightenment, and a plateau of productivity. So what happens is a technology starts out, people get really excited about it, suddenly they realize the reality is not as good as as was promised, and there's a crash in expectations. It happens every time, every major new breakthrough. And then there's this kind of slope where you start figuring out, okay, how can we be productive about this? This is why in the last part of my talk, I really tried to cover what are the nuts and bolts of using this to solve real problems. And then there's the plateau. So this is just an example of that.
Yep. Okay, I have a time's up sign flashing in my eyes here, but I'm still going to take this next question, which is, how do you think the world can come to a consensus on AI regulations and ethics?
If I may, I just wanted to touch upon the previous question, right? Because, so I think from a business perspective, right, the question is, will it hinder progress and development? I think the answer is a very big no, because on the end of that progress and development is a big economic prize that these enterprises are looking at. I mean, if you're able to have self-driving cars, self-driving trucks, it's billions of dollars of savings for the global economy, right? So it will not hinder progress and development. Now, is the media backlash proportionate? I think it should be as large as possible to put pressure so that we develop better systems, right? So the idea is, we want people to scrutinize this. We want people to have, as much scrutiny as possible and look on the hands of the people developing this. But will it hinder progress? No, because there are billions of dollars at the end of solving this very big issue.
It's a great answer.
Okay, I think we better, it's been flashing quite a while now, so I think we better wind up the session. I'm not going to give a big summary. You've all heard this, this very exciting, this fascinating discussion of the world, I was going to say the world ahead of us, but it's the world we're already in, with a very rapid pace of change and a very different world in terms of the world of work and the terms of augmentation that artificial intelligence, for want of a better word, is going to provide, hopefully, in terms of the improvement of all of our lives. And I would like to have you give a warm round of applause to our excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speakers and moderator for the first panel session. Now may I invite Ambassador Suge, Chairman of the China National Committee for the Pacific Economic Cooperation, to give tokens of appreciation for all of our speakers and the moderator of the first panel, and to have everyone to take a commemorative photo session together afterwards. Thank you.
Archer, that's totally taken by surprise.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at our first executive dialogue session of the event, entitled The Technology and Infrastructure Impacts on Trade and Trade Policy of Next Generation Communication Technologies. Please welcome the moderator of this session, Mr. Eduardo Pedrosa, General Secretary of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. Mr. Pedrosa, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for staying. It's great to see you all staying through a remarkable session. I've learned a great deal. I've got to admit that I'm still extremely confused by all of this technology. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to talk about technology and infrastructure impacts on trade and trade policy on the next generation of communication technologies. It's my great pleasure to introduce our lunch speaker for our executive dialogue. Simon Lacey is currently the Executive Vice President of Huawei Technologies. He's based in Shenzhen, China. He works for the company's Global Government Affairs division. Prior to working for Huawei, Simon has worked in over 30 economies. I've known Simon for a number of years, and I've only begun to realize just how many different places he's worked in. He provides advice on international trade and investment rules. This includes several years with the Indonesian Ministry of Trade and Industry. So welcome back to Indonesia, Simon. So he's advised on regional economic integration and WTO dispute settlement issues here. In our exchanges on this conference, Simon told us about how AI involves the collection, storage, and processing and transmission of massive amounts of data, something that depends very heavily on infrastructure, and one of the reasons why 5G promises to be such a watershed technology. During the previous session, Wojciech told us that there are now, I think, what was it, 30 billion devices that are now connected. The arrival of 5G promises many, many more. Next generation 5G networks will introduce vastly improved data speeds in the making of a global digital nervous system. They will enable radical advances in autonomous vehicles. So hopefully, Luke, we won't see those types of crashes in the future if they do improve. Factory robotics, machine learning networks, clean energy technologies, advanced medical equipment, and smart cities. So without further ado, Mr. Simon Lacey, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So, as Eduardo said, I used to be based here in Indonesia, and I worked in Ibu Mari's trade ministry for a number of years, and then came back about 7 years later and was working here again in the Ministry of Trade when Indonesia hosted the Bali Ministerial, and I always used to joke. I always used to joke that I used to work in Indonesia in trade policy, helping the government to negotiate new trade rules, implement new trade rules, and do what they were really interested in, which was violate trade rules. But what I've learned is, working in all these countries that I've worked in, is that the rules are actually there to be violated, and nobody's innocent in this game. So I think it's very appropriate that Huawei would be invited to give a talk on 5G, since we are the undisputed industry leaders now, and I've been working with Huawei about 4.5 years in doing mostly trade policy work for them and keeping markets open, and this really wasn't much of a problem for the company until about 2 years ago, and we've really run into some very strong headwinds in terms of rolling out 5G. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the trade policy impacts of 5G and what sort of policies are needed, what sort of policy environment is needed to benefit from these breakthrough innovative technologies. Before I start, the good news is that I'm not going to take up all 25 minutes that I've been allocated, and so we'll be able to get to lunch a little bit earlier. So the next generation of communication network technologies, 5G, is actually here. So the 5G era has arrived. We've started commercial deployments already in Japan, Korea. Korea is actually leading the way now in this technology in terms of deployment. China close behind, Japan, and also across Europe. And Huawei has already been awarded, at the latest count, I think it was 50 5G contracts worldwide. But of course, there's no point having 5G networks if consumers can't connect to them. So handset makers have also started to roll out 5G-equipped smartphones starting this year. And there are about 5 or 6 devices on the market right now from different manufacturers. Again, the Koreans are leading here, so Samsung, LG. The Koreans have 2 device makers, and China also has Huawei and Xiaomi that have 5G devices on the market. The benefits of 5G are manifold. So we're talking about much greater network capacity, significantly faster throughput speeds, much lower latency. So I noticed this morning when Sophia the robot was talking, there was a bit of a lag. There was some latency in terms of when she heard the question and when she responded. It's that sort of latency that's really going to disappear completely in the 5G era. And 5G also has much greater network security. But because the network architecture is primarily software-based, there are also concerns about vulnerabilities. So, because we've never lived in a world with these kind of capabilities, we are still unable to imagine all of the new applications this technology will unlock. But we can predict that it will have a marked impact in a number of fields where the constraints that 5G will overcome have been holding back progress. So I would say nowhere is this more apparent than in the virtual and augmented reality spaces, where the possibilities that 5G promises will bring major breakthroughs in the possible applications of these technologies for both productivity and entertainment. And so the real challenge for Huawei has been sort of convincing network operators to make the investments that they need to make to roll out 5G. And so the pushback has been, well, what are we going to use this for? What are the usage cases? And we've been trying to explain, what the usage cases are in terms of IoT, and those sort of things. But the truth is that because we've never lived in a 5G world, there are business models that we just haven't conceptualized yet. So another area where it's going to be a big game changer is IoT space, where it's going to have a dramatic impact in areas like factory automation, smart agriculture, logistics and supply chain management, among others. And it's also going to be, as Eduardo said, a significant enabling technology for autonomous vehicles. So how does this relate to international trade? So the trade policy implications of 5G are also becoming more obvious, and not always actually in positive ways. So as governments have slowly become cognizant of the strategic significance that communication networks will assume in a 5G era, by which I mean they're going to literally be powering everything from the financial system to a nation's power and water supply. Governments have also started to question the principles of free trade, open markets, and non-discrimination for the products, services, and equipment that power these networks. And because a relatively new player has emerged as the industry leader in 5G, and that's Huawei, and Huawei really started making its first R&D investments in 5G in 2009, just as 4G networks were being rolled out. And this is why Huawei is now a leader in 5G, because they took the decision that they were going to lead on this technology and not follow. And because Huawei is from a country whose economic rise has been very fast and very disruptive, some governments have started to question their adherence to these principles of free trade, non-discrimination, and these are principles that have served the global economy very well over the last 70 years. And this is really a shame for companies, businesses, and consumers who stand to benefit the most from these technological advances and from cost-competitive 5G technologies and solutions. And these constituencies would be best served by an approach that is non-discriminatory, minimally trade restrictive, and adheres to international standards where they exist, and favors international cooperation over unilateral interventions that risk having far-reaching and stultifying effects on markets. But that's talking about sort of the negative trade policy implications of 5G. If you talk about some of the positive benefits that 5G is going to bring, it's going to have big implications for the global trading system in many positive ways. So we anticipate that those services and solutions that already rely on moving large amounts of data across networks and onto users' end devices, but that have been held back by latency and bandwidth constraints, they're going to experience massive gains in the 5G era. And so this is obviously true in the areas of video streaming, online interactive gaming. These are both global industries with annual revenues in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And both of these industries are predicted to experience double-digit growth over the next decade. The ability to place sensors on just about everything and have these sensors collect and upload data in real time to cloud services running different AI applications is also going to allow for massive efficiency gains in all areas of transportation, logistics, whether maritime, road, rail, air, or any combination thereof. And any kind of service that can be traded across borders, we're talking about mode 1 in WTO services trade parlance, that's likewise predicted to experience considerable gains in the 5G era, which will produce upward growth effects on everything from telemedicine, online education, IT services, accounting, finance, and many other industries with combined revenues in the trillions of dollars globally. And this is just for those sort of use cases that we can already imagine. As already alluded to above, or before, sorry, the truth is that 5G promises to enable business models and use cases that we can't imagine yet. Just like the combination of 4G LTE and smartphones gave birth to the app economy and produced solutions like Uber, Spotify, Instagram, 5G is going to provide the technological preconditions for applications and use cases and business models that we simply haven't thought of yet. So what does this mean for policymakers? Well, it's important. The important thing to realize is that these new business models will only be able to be conceived, tested, brought to market and scaled in regulatory environments that do not overly inhibit innovation. And this is a big part of our messaging at Government Affairs in Huawei, is we try to convince policymakers, the benefits of sound trade and investment policies to support innovation. And because innovation plays such a central role in establishing and maintaining the profitability of firms, it's important that governments, when seeking to curtail some of the negative and unintended consequences of disruptive technologies, whether it's job losses or diminished fiscal revenues or perceived loss of regulatory sovereignty, that governments refrain from sort of overreaching to the point where they start to have a throttling effect on innovation and healthy competition. So, for example, regulatory environments that place draconian restrictions on the free flow of data, for example, or that raise the cost of service providers by forcing them to localize or use the data, or that fail to provide sufficient protection to their intellectual property. These are regulatory environments that are not going to be conducive to the new era of innovation that technologies like 5G promise to bring. And so for this reason, it's important that governments regulate in a way that's, again, non-discriminatory, least trade restrictive, and that guarantees a level playing field for all players, regardless of their country of origin or the country of origin of their technical solutions. And origin really isn't any sort of basis for implementing restrictive regulatory measures, because we're living in an age of global supply chain. So even Nokia has about 60% of its equipment manufactured in China. So trade and investment regimes that are not conducive to innovation in the digital economy may fail to reap the benefits of these new technologies. And countries can avoid this pitfall by following international best practices in policy areas of critical importance to both trade and investment and innovation. So where international norms or best practices have not yet been established, then policymakers should consult extensively with industry, with the private sector before they act, so they can find regulatory solutions that achieve the desired public policy objectives without invasive and costly interventions that radically undermine existing business models. So these are the regulatory challenges for policymakers as we step into this exciting new era of innovation, which is centered on the rollout of next generation communication technologies, which are really going to be the enabler for a lot of this groundbreaking functionality that we're going to see change work environments, change the way we live over the next 5 to 10 years. So happy to take questions. I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm used to taking difficult questions. I actually prefer the hard questions, so if anybody has any questions, please feel free. Thank you.
You can sit now. We can still be friends, Simon. It's fine. I don't know if the Slido thing is actually working. I'm not seeing questions come up. So I think can I do this traditional style? I hope you don't mind. So the floor is open. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask Simon. Well, if you don't have any, okay, I've got a question over here. Before I get to you, sir, I just wanted to immediately ask a question for Simon, because we've been friends for quite a while, and I know you're a keen observer of trade rules. So let me just ask you the really, really hard question. I'm not going to go to the immediate controversies, but I want to ask you, we work on trade policy issues, we watch these things. So let me just ask you the sort of obvious question. Look, these things are changing very quickly. This is obvious. We have the AI stuff. We know this is all very much contingent on data flows. But frankly, are the traditional trade rules, are the frameworks that we have within the GATS framework that you mentioned, the Mode 1, look, is that enough? Is that sufficient to allow the growth of this digital economy? Or are we going to run into a brick wall that is going to prevent the growth of this digital economy? And are we going to realize and wake up tomorrow that we just don't have the right rules in place, and we will just stop? We will hit a brick wall, and the innovation will stop. Simon.
Right. Look, I've had this, I noticed Peter Lovelock is here, and I've had this discussion with Peter Lovelock, and we disagree on whether or not people back in the Uruguay, trade negotiators back in the Uruguay round, actually had any sense of the digital economy or e-commerce or whatever. He seems to think they did. I think they didn't. And so we have a set of rules that isn't really, some would say fit for purpose, or isn't really, hasn't been negotiated with a view to regulating trade in the digital economy. But I think, the rules are technology neutral, first of all, and they do apply very well to the digital economy. The problem is legitimacy, and the reason why this disagreement I have with Peter Lovelock is so important is because if trade negotiators had no idea of the digital economy or the e-commerce space, and they were negotiating trade rules, and now the paradigm has shifted, should they be forced to just apply those rules to this new reality or not? And you see that in the e-commerce space with this issue over the moratorium on customs duties for electronic transmissions. So Indonesia hasn't really taken a position on this yet, but we're sort of expected to. But South Africa and India have said, we want to do away with this moratorium because when we agreed it, the digital economy was very small, but now the digital economy is so big, and the size of the revenue that we're foregoing by not taxing these is so huge that doesn't make any sense anymore. So I think that's one answer, is that rules do need to be renegotiated in light of the fact that this is now so huge. The other thing is, of course, the digital economy has been growing just fine without these rules, right? So do we really need these rules to allow the digital economy to grow, or can we just live with the status quo?
I don't know if Peter's in the room, so I don't know. I think we should give him the right to reply. But I'm going to be very cautious about taking on a lawyer on WTO jurisprudence. But I would argue that some of the panel appellate body decisions may have put more caution on the ability of WTO members to make bold decisions given the open-ended interpretations. But anyway, look, I see technology is working. What are we going to? How bold are we going to be here? So I see the top question: is Huawei having a political issue since China is not a neutral country like Finland or Denmark? I'm not.
Okay, so actually it's Finland or Sweden is the right question. Yeah. And I've made this joke a couple of times before that, nobody worries about Nokia or Ericsson because it's been a couple of 100 years since Sweden was actually a military threat to anybody. But Sweden used to be a really big military threat back in, before the 30 Years' War, before the peace of Westphalia and all that stuff. So look, I think the issue is people are just not that comfortable with China yet. And if you go back a few decades, people were very uncomfortable about Japan as well, because it was seen as this sort of upstart disruptive power. So Japan joined the GATT in 1955, and a lot of countries at that time actually invoked the right to not trade with Japan on an MFN basis, to basically not recognize it as a GATT contracting party. And that only because they were afraid that Japan was just going to be too competitive and their imports were going to put all of the domestic industries out of business. And so it actually took a while for the GATT system to become comfortable with trading with Japan. And then you had, in the 70s and 80s, you had all the problems with semiconductors, and the US felt as if Japan was a real issue. So I just think because China has come so fast, people are a little bit uncomfortable with it. And I think it'll just take time before people start to feel a bit more comfortable. And then they'll be perfectly happy to treat Chinese companies like they do companies from Finland, Denmark, or Sweden.
Good. And I think the point that you made earlier about Nokia phones being made in China, we live in a world of global value chain, so we need to sort of get out of that framework a little bit. Was a really interesting point. But having said that, there's a really interesting point, and since you said you're a lawyer and you're used to being put on the spot, let me put you on the spot and ask, what are your thoughts on Huawei's 5G technology being considered a threat to privacy? Is that an issue, Simon?
No, I think there are much greater threats to privacy than Huawei. I think we do need to sort of re-evaluate our relationship to data and all of this personal data that we generate, and because Huawei is not a company that's collecting that data and exploiting that data, because it's not an OTT provider, just provides the enabling infrastructure. I think there are much greater risks to privacy than Huawei.
That's right. I think we need to understand the entire digital ecosystem before as we get into this, and where Huawei actually sits, how it sits in that system, to understand what its actual role is. Sir, I saw you had your hand up. I wanted to give you a chance. Did you want to ask your question? Yep. Can I get a mic over here, or am I going to walk down there? I'm just going to walk down. He's going. Next to.
Don't exert yourself, Eduardo.
I don't mind walking down. It's good. I'm trying to get my steps up because I'm sharing my health data via an Apple Watch with the entire world, and it's probably being shared with other people. Sir, please.
Okay, thank you. What from the discussion we see, innovation in technology is the purpose is solving the problem, right? What I see now we have the most problem in the world is this US trade war, right? Can I use the related to AI, the neuroscience, neurotechnology, neuroinformation? What is if you use your predictive analytics, what will be the end game of this US trade war? Thank you.
Well, look, I mean, I think that's very hard to predict. But I think if you're going to be optimistic, then you would agree that China and the US are just going to have to come to terms with each other, and they're going to have to learn to live together and coexist. I mean, there's a really great book by a guy, I think it's, is it Hugh White? It's called The China Choice. He's an Australian academic. And he basically says that the US is going to have to recognize China as an equal in Asia. And if the US and China can sort of agree to collaborate on that basis, then competition doesn't need to generate, it doesn't need to degenerate into conflict. And this was a theme that was then taken up by the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee at the Shangri-La Dialogue. He gave a talk there, and he was basically saying, look, countries don't want to have to make a choice between China and America. They want to be able to trade with both and have productive relationships with both. And so it really is up to the two hegemons to find a new sort of modus operandi with one another. So I would think that both, the leadership in both countries is going to come to recognize that the cost of conflict would just be too great, and that they need to find a new sort of accommodation with one another. That would be my optimistic view.
There was a great follow-up question to that. I don't know where it's gone on the slider, but it was asking about the ability of people. It said countries or economies in a PEC context, but I guess companies. Can companies combine different types of 5G technology and use it? I guess there's a technical side to that question and remain neutral in that. There's a technical side to that? I don't understand.
No, absolutely. And so, one of the things that we're seeing is, I think in the UK, the decision was taken that they would. Well, actually, no decision has been taken yet. But there was a leak about a meeting that took place, and the Minister of Defence had to resign after that. But the decision that was leaked was that Huawei would be allowed to provide equipment in the radio access network, and then the core would be other vendors. And so, of course, you can combine different parts of equipment for different parts of the network. That's a solution that Huawei would be very happy with. Personally, I actually see that as a trade barrier, as a discriminatory trade barrier, and that's the sort of thing that I personally would want to challenge. But Huawei's not really in the business of challenging governments in terms of their decisions, unless it's something really egregious that threatens to undermine the whole business model.
The other screen over there is flashing that time's up. I wanted to ask you to all join me in thanking Simon for his very open and frank discussion of some very difficult issues. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Lacey, for the insightful address. Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Pedrosa to give a token of appreciation for Mr. Simon Lacey and have a commemorative photo session together. Ladies and gentlemen, I hate to be the one standing in between your lunchtime, so please allow me to inform that lunch will be served outside of this conference hall and at the back of the hall at the promenade and near the exhibition booth as well. I'd like to kindly remind to all participants to take their belongings with them during lunch as to avoid any unintended events during the proceeding of the lunch. And I'd like to inform as well that the next plenary session will begin promptly at 1:30 or 13:30. VIP participants, please enjoy your lunch at the Banda B Hall near the conference stage. And please refer to our organizers to help you bring you to the lunch area. And some more additional information for those of you who have registered for the Youth Dialogue. Please kindly confirm and report in front of the reception desk for the Youth Dialogue on the second day of the event. And also for all of you who need materials for the event, please find the materials at the CSIS Global Dialogue website. Thank you. And also another kindly reminder for all participants to register for the breakout sessions at the reception desk. Thank you.